covers the Major League Baseball scene, the draft, looking at prospects, the minor leagues, worked in a front office before, knows how this all goes down. And many times, Keith, when you and I have had conversations, it would seem to be about the mistakes that the Phillies organization has made. And I know they've lost 5 in a row, 9 of 11. They are at 500 right now. But looking at what this team has done over the last, 6, 7, 8 months, going back to last year, is this an organization that you look at on the upswing?
Absolutely. I think anybody who's concentrating on this year's record has really, really missed the point. This was not going to be a winning team this year. It was not going to be a playoff team this year. If they avoid 90 losses, I would say that this was a good season for them. This is about getting some of the young players to the big leagues to try to integrate them. This is about continuing the development of players like Aaron Nola, hopefully at some point of Michael Franco. It was about trying out Tyler Goodell, seeing if Odubel Herrera's great rookie season was a mirage, as I think a lot of people thought it would be, because he was pretty unheralded as a prospect. That's the kind of things that the Phillies should have been hoping to accomplish this season. If they happen to win 10 more games than anyone expected, that's nice, but this was never about trying to get to the playoffs in 2016.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I think a lot of people are pretty stunned about where they are. What are some of the things that have stood out? You mentioned Herrera. He had a good year last year. People were like, all right, he had a nice little year. He has, I think he's number 2 in on-base percentage in all of baseball. He's walking more. He has got to be a guy. Do you look at him now as a guy that you think, yes, he is a player, they can, they found something?
At the very least, I think you got to consider him an everyday player, just given the performance for the last 12 months. Well, more than 12 months, really. I mean, you get a Rule 5 guy who turns out to be like an extra guy, like a good fourth outfielder, that's a win. And it turns out they may have gotten at least a solid regular, maybe a guy who's an above-average regular. It's an outstanding outcome for them. It gives them options, too, because now if you look at him, you think Adele is a fourth, fifth outfielder. They've got Nick Williams coming. He's struggling in AAA, but he's still a prospect. They're going to have some extra outfielders at some point, which is a good place to be because maybe it opens them up to make a trade for something else they need down the line.
Yeah, Keith, you mentioned Williams, and how much did that Hamels deal really turn, the page for this team in terms of taking a step in the right direction? Was that the move that really got them, taking that big jump?
I think of all the trades that they've made, probably the Giles trade was the bigger jump just because they moved an asset without really a ton of value, right? He's a short reliever. Those guys are volatile, and they they could get worse at any time. They only provide you 60, 70 innings. There are fewer teams that would be interested in trading for a short reliever or closer than for a guy like Cole Hamels. The Hamels deal was a great deal. The Giles deal, I think, is the one we're going to look back on and say that was an absolute heist. That's a franchise-altering moment for them.
And it was going to get to that Giles move. You see Velasquez. Do you think that he was the key to that deal? Looking back on it, was he the guy that they had, that really jumped that deal into their favor big time?
The way they've described it to me after the fact, of course, was just that it was the quantity. It was how much they were potentially getting back in the deal. Not so much that it was any one specific prospect or player, because it's not a situation where they were getting, an Alex Bregman type who's the Astros' top prospect. It's just that we're getting a couple of different guys we like, we think can fit our roster. They're all young. They're all cheap. Maybe Velasquez turns into a number 3 starter and Mark Appel doesn't work out. Well, that's still a pretty good outcome for you. Just the fact that they were able to get so many different assets back in exchange for a guy who they really didn't have a whole lot of use for. And I think, who knows what the other actual offers were for Giles, but I find it hard to imagine them getting much more total value, just looking at it as a package, than what they ended up getting from the Astros.
Keith Law's with us. And Keith, I think when you see what the Phillies have done in the back end of their bullpen with Neris and Gomez, it shows you that if you can spin off a guy like that, a lot of teams might be trying to do a similar thing where, hey, if we have a closer on a bad team, you might see a lot of people making calls to try to get rid of guys like that.
No question. You should. It's the most disposable, frivolous asset that a bad team can have. You just don't need a closer. You don't really even need a good setup guy. I mean, Cincinnati has one of the worst bullpens ever, maybe, this year. The thing is, they weren't going to the playoffs even if they had a great bullpen. It doesn't matter. I understand it matters to the fans in the short term because, yes, the Reds fan right now, they're all considering throwing themselves into the Ohio River. But the point is, This team is not going, you're not catching the Cubs and the Pirates this year. So don't spend money on relievers. And if you have a good reliever and you have the opportunity to flip him for long-term assets, everyday players and or starting pitchers, you got to do that every time. And if they can create another one, if Neris turns out to have some crazy value, and he's been crazy good so far, maybe you flip him for one or two prospects. Don't get wedded to the relievers because they're not long-term pieces.
Keith Law, ESPN.com. Keith, on this current roster, the last couple of years we would talk and say, all right, they got Hamels, Utley, Rollins. Can they move these guys? There was a lot of veteran players at other teams. Do they have pieces on this team? If you are a GM of another team, you're calling the Phillies for?
Probably not really, nothing significant. I mean, could they get something for a Freddie Galvis type because someone's looking for a backup infielder at some point? Yeah, probably. But nothing that's going to give us a substantial return. We're not going to have a conversation on August 2nd or 3rd because the deadline's on the 1st this year, where we're talking about the huge prospects they got back in the deadline deals. When we have that conversation, we'll probably be talking about who's coming up in August and talking a little bit about the fruits of the Phillies draft, because obviously they pick first, not just first overall, but then first again in every round of the draft next week.
Tell us a little bit more about that draft. We locally here, Jason Groom is about 40 minutes from our studio, so we hear a lot about him. We've seen him throw a handful of times. It sounds like the Phillies are not interested in him, but is he a guy that you think they should consider?
The guy currently first on my board, so I do a big board and then I do mock, predicted first rounds also. The guy first on my board is actually a college outfielder, Corey Ray from the University of Louisville. Groom is second. I would absolutely consider Groom if I were at the first overall pick, but I do not see this as a situation where they have to take it. Certainly, I don't give any points for him being local, because as far as I'm concerned, you just want the best players. But also, there's risk with high school pitchers, and only 3 high school pitchers have ever gone first overall in the draft, all left-handed like Groom, and for various reasons, none of them have worked out so far. So it's not like there's really encouraging precedents here either. The player I believe they're going to take, the guy I've had them taking in the first 2 mock drafts I've done so far, is a college lefty, University of Florida, named A.J. Puck. He is 6'7". He's got to weigh at least 240, 250. I have personally seen him 93 to 97. He's got a good changeup. Breaking ball kind of comes and goes. They'll throw some strikes. It's not great command right now. I still think he's a little bit of a project. You could probably compare him a little bit to Mark Appel when he was coming out of college, where all the pieces were there for you to have a number 1 or number 2 starter, but there's work to do. This is not Michael Wacha, who's going to come into the minors in June, and 12 months later he's in the big leagues.
The Major League Baseball draft, different from football and basketball, or and even basketball and football, you don't draft for need as much, you draft best player. But is that baseball too? You're not looking at a need, because the Phillies do have depth in pitching. All of a sudden, they got 5 pitchers for Giles, they got a bunch of pitchers for Hamels. So some would say, well, they got so much pitching in their organization, why not take the best offensive player? Is that a philosophy or not the way the draft works?
You take best player available, and when teams have tried to diverge from that in baseball history, it's led to some pretty colossal mistakes. Now, that said, if there were a high-end shortstop in the draft, high school or college, someone in the middle of the field, guaranteed to stay in the middle of the field, you can bet that that's who the Phillies would be taking. The problem is the players at the top of the draft, and if you look at my rankings, I've got one up now, another one goes up tomorrow. There's not a whole lot of change at the top in that one, but there's some high school arms, which the Phillies have just said philosophically they don't want to take, and then most of the position players are not at positions up the middle. It's a lot of corner outfielders, third basemen who might end up first baseman, catchers who can't catch. It's probably not a great year to have the first overall pick. There's no Bryce Harper. There's not even a Manny Machado in this draft class. There are very, very good players, but if there's a transcendent player, there's a superstar in the making, none of us has figured out who he is.
Keith Law is with us. I know J.P. Crawford at the top of a lot of lists, and yours included, and how close do you think he is?
My guess right now is that they're planning to get him up in August or September. You notice they slow-tracked him a little bit at the beginning. He did not look great in spring training. They let him spend about 6 weeks in Double-A, where he finished last year, which is fine. What he really showed me in Double-A was just he is outclassing the pitchers at that level. His eye, his plate discipline, his whole approach are just so good that Double-A pitchers really couldn't figure him out, and he was walking like crazy, even though he wasn't hitting for particularly high average. I had higher expectations from him in the batting average department. Now he's going to face in Triple-A a lot of pitchers who are close to big league caliber, pitchers who've been in the big leagues before. That is a new challenge for him, specifically the way that he operates, the way that he works the count. I think he's going to have to make some adjustments, and we'll see. He may make them very quickly, in which case you could see him in the big leagues sooner. But my guess is give him about 3 months down there, and then we'll see him in Philadelphia.
Hey, Keith, has Aaron Nola exceeded some expectations? Has he been better at the major league level than people projected?
I would say so. And specifically, I would say it's because of the curveball. Having seen him in college, this was a guy who'd show you 3 pitches. None of them was really plus. What really made him stand out was the fastball command was exceptional. All of that is still true, except now the curveball that was kind of an above-average pitch, to me, is a swing-and-miss pitch, and has been consistently so really since he got to the big leagues. So that, to me, where I said previously I thought he was probably a number 3 starter, bit better than a league-average starter, a guy you never worry about, but he's probably never pitching towards the top of your rotation. He's better than that. He's probably your 2 when it's all said and done. You're hoping for one guy in the rotation who's better than that. But if he is their number 1 for the next couple of years, I think that's going to be just fine.
You still looking at Tommy Joseph as a guy who can pan out?
I'm skeptical, but I'm glad they're giving him some kind of opportunity because you got to see what you got. He certainly performed well enough in the minors. It's a shame he can't catch anymore. I understand it's entirely physical. It's just out of the question. It's so hard for a guy to profile at first base. That said, they were still messing around with Darren Ruff. I think they gave him plenty of chances. It was time to turn the page on that one and give Joseph an opportunity. He's younger. I think he's a better hitter than Ruff, maybe not with the unbelievable raw power of a Ruff. See what he is. Maybe he ends up playing first for 2-3 years, and you end up if you end up with a better player, he's a guy you move along because someone's looking for a bench piece or a platoon guy, which might be a pretty good future for him. For a guy who looked like he might be out of baseball
a year or two ago. He's been a nice story, at least giving him a shot. And they do have Alfaro, I guess, as a piece from that Hamels deal, who's had a pretty good start. But I know he has been injured too. But he looks like a guy who can hit the ball as at that catching position.
He can really throw. He's got probably 80 raw power, top-of-the-line raw power. And he's got great bat speed, so he can catch up the stuff. He'll make a lot of hard contact. He walks about once a month, which is not ideal. And the receiving aspect of his game defensively still needs work. And I think it's less physical in his case, and it's more mental. It's focused. Catcher is a position where you're involved in basically every pitch when you're on the field, and he hasn't really shown that mentality yet. I know the Phillies are optimistic. Now that they've gotten the kid in and they've gotten to know him a little bit, they don't seem to be at all inclined to move him off the position. Because if he stays at catcher and is just adequate receiving with the throwing and the power, he's an all-star. There's so much upside there as long as you can keep him behind the plate. So I think they're doing the right thing working with him, even though they recognize that there's going to be a lot of effort involved.
ESPN senior baseball writer Keith Law, the Phillies. We mentioned Alfaro and some of the other guys. Are there other guys that we haven't mentioned that you want to mention that you should say to Phillies fans, hey, keep your eye, not only on Crawford, we mentioned Alfaro, Nick Williams, a lot of people know. Are there other guys that we should have our eye on?
Well, Jake Thompson seems to have been better the last couple of times out in AAA. My guess is you'll see him in the back of the big league rotation at some point later this year. There'll be an injury. There'll be another opportunity. He's more of a solid fourth starter type. Came over in the Hamels deal, but I certainly think that there's value there. Scott Kingery and Cornelius Randolph were their first 2 picks last year. I thought the 2 best picks of their draft, too. Neither's gotten off to a huge start so far this year, but they're just names to keep an eye on. And I like Rhys Hoskins in Double-A. That Double-A club has a lot of guys who are raking just because Reading is a good place to hit. I think Dylan Cousins has all but 1 or 2 of his home runs at home so far. But Hoskins, to me, doesn't have the raw power of a guy like Dylan Cousins, but he's a better hitter. He's very, very quiet approach, very simple. He's almost like an unassuming guy when he's at the plate, but then you look up and you realize the results are pretty consistently good. And I do think he'll play in the big leagues. He might be more of an everyday type without stardom, but I think a useful piece somewhere in a major league lineup.
All right, good stuff on the Phillies. They take on Washington in the final game of that 3-game set. Adam Morgan gets the call for the Phils tonight. Max Scherzer goes for the Nationals. Keith Law, ESPN.com senior baseball writer. Thank you, Keith.
My pleasure.